Forward. Welcome back to what is, technically, the last entry in my video series examining Final Fantasy Tactics. I say technically because the previous video looking at the historiography of the game was really the last proper entry. So what's this even doing here? Well, in literature, a miscellany is a collection of assorted bits of writing about a variety of topics or subjects, but generally without any cohesive, overarching narrative. So in this case, rather than a formal video essay, this will be a loose collection of pieces which were excluded from the other videos for a variety of reasons. They were subjects which no longer fit within the analysis after a script edit, or I thought that it was something interesting and worth discussing, but which I could not effectively tie into a specific video. As such, there are a variety of analyses, musings, and my personal perspective on a range of topics. I hope you find them interesting. Atheism in a world full of gods. So the first thing which needs to be pointed out is that, in the world of Final Fantasy Tactics, gods and monsters, ghosts and demons are all real. Not figurative, not symbolic, but actual corporeal beings which are capable of interacting with and influencing the world. Now, the question of what constitutes a god may be a worthwhile discussion in the context of Ivalice, an interesting thought experiment, but it's not really what I'm on about here. So let's consider atheism. Atheism, that being the philosophical or intellectual position that there is not enough evidence to justify belief in the existence of a deity, is, in the world of Ivalice, a status ailment, or buff, depending on your playstyle. It is a condition which can be inflicted upon someone, but it is never presented as a matter of theology, not something reached based on logic or reason. Mechanically, when a character has the status effect atheist active, they become immune to magic of every kind: black, white, time, mystic, summon, holy, and demonic. I like to think that Elder Simon, after reading the scriptures of Germanique, just instantly had a permanent atheist status cast on him. Atheism itself is a condition which drops one of the key mechanical components of the entirety of the magic system: faith. Effectively, the higher or lower the faith of a character, the lesser or greater effect magic has on them. It is a character stat which can be temporarily and permanently raised. As experienced players will know, if you raise the faith of any permanent character except Ramza too high, they can leave your party, having what amounts to a religious awakening. And I mean, it sort of makes sense. Where faith has a mechanistic effect on how you are able to act and engage with things like magic, atheism as a rational theological position doesn't make any sense. Now, on the other hand, you have Ramza dramatically discussing losing his faith after reading the scriptures of Germanique, with no effect on him. I think it could have been interesting, especially since it's technically optional. You don't, after all, have to read the scriptures of Germanique, that if you actually do, that Ramza would either lose a significant portion of his faith stat, or have permanent atheism as a status while a heretic. If we take this idea of atheism as a status effect and place it in a historic medieval context, it also has a kind of internal logic. It can be incredibly difficult to escape the trap of presentism when examining the past, especially a past separated by such a significant span of time and almost foreign worldview. We need to consider that as someone who experiences the world as being inhabited by the supernatural, there is a fundamental difference in understanding. This is something which Final Fantasy Tactics does mechanically, but in such a muted way that it is incredibly subtle. Yet when you take the time to consider the implications, how else could a perspective like atheism be represented in such a world? World mythology. So I've talked a lot about how the historic and political setting of the War of the Lions is supposedly based on the English Civil War known as the War of the Roses, which took place during the mid to late 15th century. I've also talked about how the mythology of the Glabadocian religion and how it subsumed the pre-Glabadocian myth of the Zodiac Braves used this to incorporate and account for the Lucavi and Ultima as the embodied gods of the universe of Final Fantasy Tactics. But something I didn't really discuss, and something which can be completely missed depending on your playthrough, is the place that espers have within this cosmological model. Summons have been a staple of the Final Fantasy series since their introduction in 3, and Tactics leverages this in the job of Summoner. The job description for Summoner reads as follows: a warrior who may summon the most powerful of spirits, the beings known as espers. Now, in the original PlayStation version, these were just known as summons, and the naming convention in War of the Lions is yet again building on the nomenclature established in Final Fantasy XII, albeit in that instance the Lucavi are called espers, so it's not wholly consistent. The thing is that the game doesn't offer much of anything in terms of tying the espers to the broader mythology, and on the one hand that's understandable. The developers already had a model in mind for the way the cosmology of Ivalice worked, and needlessly introducing more complicated narrative elements could have muddled things. The espers are included because they wanted a high-powered magic-based job which leveraged the existing model of the franchise which was offered. On the other hand, it's still kind of incredible to think about how these espers fit into the world view. I mean, here you have creatures from European folklore like salamanders, fairies, more properly pixies, and sylphs. Classical monsters like the biblical Leviathan or the Hellenic Cyclops, and deities like the Hindu Shiva, the Hellenic Titan, and the Icelandic Odin. And even staples of the series like Mughals and Bahamut. At least in the case of Mughals, if you examine the information for the random battle location, Chigaloth Fenlands, you get a sad little blurb about Mughals being extinct. And so perhaps the Mughal Esper is simply what remains, preserved in a spirit form. So while I think it's an interesting idea to try to conceptualize, I do think it's simply a case of not really putting too much thought into the cosmological implications of including real-world deities into your game, particularly when you've gone out of your own way to create your own Christ-like, but not Christ, figure. The thing about Cuchulain. So, as I had figured some keen-eared watcher would notice, in the Saint Ajora is Not Dead video, I called the Lucavi Cardinal Delacroix transformed into Cuchulain, after the original translation for the PlayStation 1 version of the game, instead of the War of the Lions version which uses the name Cuchulain. So for those who may or may not be aware, Cuchulain is the name of the central figure of the Ulster cycle of Irish medieval literature, and a significant figure in hypothetical pre-Christian Irish mythology. Cuchulain, a character who is deliberately grotesque, has no features or characteristics which are related to Cuchulainn whatsoever. Now, there is a character from medieval Irish literature whose name is Credenvale, who happens to have a mouth on his torso. He is also a representation of gluttony and avarice, who shows up in one of the most important texts of the mythological cycle, Cathmagatora, or the Second Battle of Moytura. Now, this is a personal beef. Irish mythology is something near and dear to my heart, and I just cannot bring myself to acknowledge what was a very bizarre choice from the developers to go with. Doubly so that it was based on the character's name in Final Fantasy XII, probably my least favorite game in the entire franchise. So let me explain. Here is a description of Cuchulainn from the Táin Bó Cúailnge, or the Cattle Raid of Cooley, one of the major sources of lore about Cuchulainn. I'm using Thomas Kinsella's translation. Cuchulainn came out the next morning to view the armies and display his noble fine figure to the matrons and virgins, and young girls, and poets and bards. He came out to display himself by day because he felt the unearthly shape he had shown them the night before had not done him justice. And certainly, the youth Cuchulain mac Sualtam was handsome as he came to show his form to the armies. The Connacht woman climbed on the soldiers, and the Munster woman climbed on their own men to see Cuchulain. So Cuchulain is described in this instance as incredibly good-looking. Even Queen Maeve, the leader of the combined armies trying to invade Ulster at the time, who is currently hiding because Cuchulain is an incredibly skilled sling user, can't help herself and climbs up to take a look. So this excerpt mentions that Cuchulain had taken on an unearthly shape the night before, and this refers to his riastrid, which does not have a direct equivalent in English, but is generally translated as warp spasm. It's another overly long description, but it's a literary device used to extol the superlative nature of Cuchulain as a warrior after his transformation. The first warp spasm seized Cuchulain and made him into a monstrous thing, hideous and shapeless, unheard of. His shanks and his joints, every knuckle and angle and organ from head to foot, shook like a tree in the flood or a reed in the stream. His body made a furious twist inside his skin, so that his feet and shins and knees switched to the front. It goes on and gets even more bizarre before it passes, and he dons his armor, hops into his sickle chariot, and wages a one-man war against the entirety of the armies of the 4 united provinces of Ireland. The aftermath is described as follows. Not 1 man in 3 escaped without his thigh bone, or his head, or his eye being smashed, or without some blemish for the rest of his life. And when the battle was over, Cuchulain left without a scratch or a stain on himself, his helper, or either of his horses. As I mentioned earlier, Cuchulain is an important mythologic and literary figure, arguably considered to be the greatest hero in Irish myth. So while this is a contentious and ultimately not especially important claim, because this subject is one which has deep personal significance, it really does bother me that the representation of Cuchulain the game presents is Cuchulain. So yeah, he'll always be Cuchulain to me. The most political Final Fantasy? So on September 9th, 2020, I posted a very scientific poll in our Final Fantasy asking which of the following games in the franchise were the most political. 6, 7, Tactics, 9, 12, and 15. The overwhelming majority of the 296 votes that were cast went to 12, with 144, or 49%. Tactics, on the other hand, was second with 77, or 26%, and 7 was in third with 55, or 19%. Now, after some discussion with a few folks better versed in statistical analysis than myself, they suggested doing the poll again with a different group, and then comparing the two results. Again, this is hardly scientific or even definitive, but I still think it can provide something interesting to discuss. Therefore, on December 24th, 2020, I posted the same poll in our JRPG and got some interesting, albeit surprising results. Of these 778 votes, 311, or 39%, went to 12, but this time, 298, or 38%, went to Tactics, with 7 a distant third at 108, or 14%. So what can be taken away from this? A few things first. As Reddit limits poll options to 6 choices, the games which were offered were up to me to decide, and I chose the ones I felt had the strongest political themes. The one caveat being that in both cases, there were some users who lamented that Final Fantasy XIV had been left out. My justification for its exclusion was that because it was an MMORPG and narrative stability was constantly in flux, owing to the inevitability of expansions which could fundamentally alter the game, I decided that it was best to leave it off. Secondly, in both polls, I did not provide what I meant by political. That was left up to the voter to determine for themselves. In the initial poll, this was the largest point of contention, as people wanted to know what I meant by political. In the second, this seemed to be less of an issue. So the first interesting but expected result was that the understanding of what the idea of political meant was effectively bifurcated between the political as drama and the political as thematic. The second was that if the overt narrative of each game can be understood as the primary means by which individuals reply to the question, then the overwhelming number of respondents, 75% in the first poll and 77% in the second, interpreted political as dramatic over thematic. It's also worth mentioning that the second poll seemed to have some more nuance and blending of the two approaches to politics, like recognizing the colonialism inherent in Final Fantasy XII or the class struggle in Tactics, both of which tend to fall into the dramatic category. This observation is based on the comments below the poll, but the discourse was interesting. Now this all sort of gets back to the criticism or refrain of keeping politics out of games, and how the more you actually examine this position, the less tenable it really is. In each of their total iterations, Final Fantasy XII has sold around 7.2 million copies worldwide, while Tactics has sold around 2.9 million. They are both clearly understood to be political. So what's the problem? Well, it's that bifurcation I mentioned earlier where politics is understood as mechanistic or dramatic versus thematic or, political causes. Seemingly no one has an issue with politics being the central narrative point of a game when it is the mechanistic understanding of what politics are: statecraft, maneuvering, backstabbing, forming alliances, and so on. Where issues arise is when the perception of the thematically political, feminism, LGBTQ representation, anti-capitalism, environmentalism, and so on, are included and centered in the narrative. Except, of course, Final Fantasy VII has outsold both games, combined, at around 24.2 million units. Even if you remove the total sales for all the compilations material, which is around 5.9 million units, and Remake, which is at around 5 million units, you are still left with around 13.6 million units of the original game across multiple platforms. I also believe that 7 being consistently ranked third is reflective of the political themes of the game, as the mechanistic side is very heavily subsumed, especially when compared to Tactics or 12. At the end of the day, if anything of value can be extracted from these polls, what I think is represented here is the successful delineation between the cultural and the material from the political. In the popular imagination, anyways. That so many people are able to so easily separate the mechanics of how political actors function from the systems within which they operate speaks volumes about how these same individuals understand real-world politics. So in this instance, the high political drama represents what most respondents felt was the political, whereas political causes were seen as secondary, but still the next largest category. This despite the fact that both the Ivalice entries still incorporated heavily cultural political elements, like class struggle, imperialism, colonialism, and post-colonialism. 7, for its part, also presents the mechanistic side of things, except that the state has been subsumed by the Schneider Electric Power Company, and so operates in a less obvious, and as I have argued elsewhere, more insidious manner. I think that when these games are approached from a materialist lens, when one understands that separating the politically mechanistic from the politically thematic is a flawed way of approaching and interpreting a text, especially one which seeks to leverage politics in its narrative, a more concrete appreciation of how both are necessary for understanding how politics functions emerges. The raise problem. For longtime fans of Final Fantasy Tactics, the character of Raise Dular is well known. A relatively late addition to the party in Chapter 4, and one of a number of optional side characters. She starts life out as a holy dragon, sought after by the character Beowulf Cadmus. But if you can successfully locate the cursed island of Nelveska and defeat Construct 7, she will be transformed back into her human form. Ray's unique job is Dragonkin, and her skill set is Dragon, which, aside from providing stat buffs to Dragon-type monster player characters, also gives her access to the 3 elemental Dragon Breath attacks, as well as a unique Holy Breath attack. Her skills are decent, but what really makes her stand out are her stats. Dragonkin has the best overall stat growth of any of the special jobs. While her equipment is limited to bags and ribbons, she does have innate double hand, meaning if you give her the brawler support ability, she hits like a ninja monk combo. If you level her up in her base class, she begins to surpass even Orlandu in damage output in short order. Mechanically, Raze is a favorite among many longtime players of the series. So what's her character like? She loves Beowulf. That's it. That is literally all we know about her. And maybe in the original version of the game, this was enough? After all, Beowulf's character arc is finding Raze in her cursed dragon form and restoring her to a human, so it isn't especially deep either. This is true for all non-story secret characters, because the narrative elements are contained within the side quests themselves. But then in the War of the Lions, we get the Celebrant Bremont side quest, where Raze is once again the victim whom Beowulf must save. And the question I have is why? Raze is a stronger character than Beowulf, and it isn't even close. So why, when the devs were given the choice to expand their story, did they continue the damsel in distress motif and not do something novel, like have Raze rescue Beowulf? As I've made abundantly clear in the series, one of the greatest strengths the game has is in its ability to leverage the mechanics of combat to reinforce the narrative, and this would have been an incredible chance to do just that. What a missed opportunity. Ramza and Wygraf. Wygraf is certainly one of the more compelling characters in Final Fantasy Tactics, especially during the first chapter where he serves as the foil to Ramza and the nobility. The War of the Lions fleshes out the backstory of Wygraf following the defeat of the Corpse Brigade, providing a narrative sequence where he is approached by the Templar Lawfrey and offered a place in their order. Wygraf does not yet abandon his goals, as he is enticed by the offer of the Church to create a more just state of affairs in Ivalice. In Chapter 3, Ramza winds up confronting Wygraf once again, this time as a Templar, and the following exchange takes place. Wygraf, you live? I have lived for this, Ramza. How long has it been since we last met? Then you were a warrior who fought to make your dreams reality. Now you are only a thrall of the Church. What troubled sleep have you known, to speak of my dreams? No matter how sweet a dream left unrealized must fade into day. Only with power can dreams be made real. I see the truth of it now. What good dreams without that power? You think me a thrall? So be it. Your envenomed words succor me, for when at last you yield, as you must, their poison will consume you. I pity you, Wygraf. Even as a man of broken dreams, you might still have been remembered fondly. Your ideas lifted the people, showed them the cracks in the age-old facade of the aristocracy. You acted on your convictions, and so ennobled those actions. But what would the people think now? What would Maluda and your fallen friends think of this barter you've struck? Dreams built on borrowed stone are defiled before they are made. What have you done that did not rely on the labor of others? From birth, you have wanted for nothing. You cannot know what it is to live the meager life we do. Reason may trick you to believe you do, but your heart can never know. Harsh is the world in which we live, harsher still than you can imagine. You have neither right nor reason to pour scorn on me. Ultimately, Ramza is victorious and mortally wounds Wygraf, who is forced to flee. The supreme irony, of course, is that ultimately, Ramza becomes the champion of the masses while Wygraf is killed and is transformed into a Lucavi. Ramza's constant chiding of Wygraf about how Maluda would have felt about what he has become is, frankly, a little gross, considering Ramza was the one who killed her. Thematically it makes sense. Wygraf is supposed to have betrayed everything he believed in for power, and Ramza was now the one carrying on the fight against injustice. But imagine if the guy who killed your sibling had the temerity to lecture you on how she would feel about your life choices. It's just not especially good writing, I find, and I think the possibility of a redemption arc, not for Wygraf, mind you, but Ramza, for murdering Maluda, would have been an interesting twist. The horror. Final Fantasy Tactics is incredibly violent, like really violent for 1997, even compared to other entries in the franchise both before and after. Its two closest contemporaries, Final Fantasy VII and VIII, also feature a lot of violence, characters getting stabbed, slashed, impaled, and so on, but there is very little depictions of blood overall. Tactics, on the other hand, while it is quite muted in Chapter 1, Gustav being stabbed and Titra being shot presents no blood whatsoever. By the end of Chapter 3, you bear witness to the aftermath of the massacre of Rylvain's castle. Chapter 4 also features the very violent deaths of several central characters, culminating with Hashmal disemboweling himself to summon Ultima. It's just a lot of graphic violence for its time, is all. Afterward. Well, that about wraps it up. I told you it was going to be short and rambling. With any luck, at the very least, I was able to present some ideas worth thinking about. So that's it. I am now both officially and technically finished with Final Fantasy Tactics and the Kingdom of Ivalice. And so I really do hope that you enjoyed this series. To be honest, when I started this channel back in April of 2020, I didn't have any plans to even talk about Final Fantasy Tactics. And seeing as these have been some of the more popular videos that I've produced, and that a lot of people really like them, well, it's very gratifying as a creator, and I really do appreciate it. I also hope that you stick around to see what I'm going to be working on next. Thanks for your time.